Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for the evening, Mr. Berry Nall. He resides in Starr County, Texas, where he pastors a small church and teaches computer science and pre-engineering courses at Roma High School. He is a butterfly enthusiast who enjoys raising as well as photographing butterflies. And for the past 12 years, he has been collaborating with Dr. David Wagner to gather life history information on Texas moths. His presentation this evening is entitled Taxing Discoveries, where he will be explaining how taxonomy can be used to predict host plants used by caterpillars and vice versa. He will share some adventures in the fields, which led to fascinating discoveries using taxonomical relationships. So with that, let's welcome our presenter this evening, Berry Nall.
Before I start the actual presentations, I teach computer science at the high school, and the students have to do a project where they're supposed to create a fake business page to invite people in. So I did this as a sample, and I really like the way it came out, so I thought I'd show it. You hover over this, you can see different butterflies on the cube, and you can mess with the colors on the Isabella heliconian. And I didn't look up the name, but you mess with these colors and there's a butterfly from South America or Central America instead of here. But anyways, so I have a lot of fun with computer science and the kids, and those are some butterflies from around here flying around. The other thing, which I guess we can't see now the lights are out, but you know, I use cages sometimes to rear caterpillars. That's okay, don't turn them on for this. I use cages to rear caterpillars, and you always learn something new. The caterpillars, it was a grass feeding caterpillar, so I actually had a pot of grass in there, and I always take out a couple for photographing that I keep isolated, and the rest I keep in the cage until I need them or whatever. So I wasn't paying much attention until I noticed they make shelters. They were making shelters out of the netting of the cage. They ate holes in this nice, beautiful cage. And so I moved them into a jar with some filter paper on the bottom, and then they proceeded to cut shelters out of the filter paper. And it was like if you take I don't know, I guess you would call it an American taco when you take the tortilla and fold it in half, but not roll it. That's what the shelters look like, and it was kind of funny. But they ruined a beautiful cage for me. All right, on to the presentation. So as the title says, taxing discoveries, how taxonomical relationships can eventually, making a little play on words, taxing as in taxonomy, but also as in it was taxing even after we used the taxonomy. So that, what is the topic? We're going to see what we can learn from taxonomy and apply that to finding some caterpillars. Basically, all I know on the subject, I learned from Dr. David Wagner, caterpillar expert. And so if I say things correctly, it's credit to him. If I don't, it's my fault. And then as far as I looked up common names, because I don't always use the same names, I did use, for some reason, plants of deep South Texas. So we need to give credit to Mr. King. All right. Taxonomy, I used to do a little bit of biology review when they had this thing called the tax test years ago. And we would teach, you got to remember, there are 7 divisions. Go back to Linnaeus. King Philip came over for good soup or sandwiches or something with an S. The kids use a different word, but I don't know who's watching. So, and we just do that and say we classify everything, but we don't really give them any reasons why. And that's one of the problems sometimes when you have to cover a million things in too little bit of time, that you can't really put it in context. So we use these nice, clean 7 categories. But in real life, nature's not that clean. I put the definition I found up there that I liked. It's intended to indicate natural relationships. Well, you have to try to put them in the right place, but then as we get more and more organisms, I mean, I don't know how many organisms were known when Linnaeus and those guys fixed up this system in the 1700s or whatever it was, but we got a whole lot more now. So we've got to divide it more, and so they've added different divisions between family and species, and that's where the taxonomy of caterpillars comes in. So, taxing issue number 1 is taxonomy is constantly changing names, and Ken can attest to this in the plants. I'm going to be talking about a moth that's genus is Syssphinx, or it was when I first started looking at them, and then it was Fingicampa, and now it's probably Syssphinx again, but it may become, I mean, you know, they keep changing it, and I have a hard enough time remembering one name, and then when all that. But the reason they do that is because they're getting more and more information about relationships, especially now that they take the DNA and they look at the DNA barcode, they call it, and they compare it. And so they're revising things all the time. As far as this talk is concerned, I'm not too worried about revisions, except sometimes it confuses what you're looking for. For example, I don't know how many years ago, Ken might be able to say, but maybe let's say 40 years ago. If you looked at Wamuchil or Ebony or Havartia, they were all in the genus Pithecolobium. Now they're all in separate genuses. So to the botany side of things, the importance of them being in the same genus, plants, is that they'll have the same molecules that the caterpillars need to use. The caterpillars, if they stick to one plant, it's because they need certain molecules that that plant has, and maybe it's not in many other plants. And when we use taxonomy to find the caterpillars, we're looking for what are called specialists. They feed on only 1 or 2 or 3, but very limited number of species of plants. And because of that, and because they're getting certain molecules that are only in those few species, other caterpillars in the same genus will probably feed on similar or even the same plants. So if you know what one caterpillar feeds on, and you're looking at a sister species, you look for plants that are very closely related, but also have the same range generally as the moth or caterpillar. And I got to learn to use this. I hadn't seen it before, but it says potential host plants can be identified by looking at relatives of the butterfly or more commonly moth. Now, why moths more than butterflies? Virtually all the moths, virtually all the butterfly host plants for our area are known. There might be a few things, but and I should say for our areas, I should say the butterflies that come to our area, the host plants are generally known. Whereas there are many moths where they don't know the host plant. And what Dr. Wagner's doing at this point, because he's found so many, if he has a new caterpillar, he doesn't know what it is, he goes taxonomically down and he looks in the species in that genus or in that subfamily, and he says, what am I missing? This is probably it. And he's more right than wrong. And then, as I say, he also goes the reverse direction. He says, what are the plants? And he looks for that. So we're looking for caterpillars that have a very limited host plant. They probably aren't common, or else we would have found them by accident, because one of the things we do is we go around, some of you have seen this, wrapping branches on trees or plants, whatever, and we have a sheet underneath, and hopefully the caterpillars fall off under the sheet, and then we rear them out and find out what they are. So when it comes to using taxonomy, we're looking for caterpillars we haven't been able to find by accident, and we haven't been able to rear them yet. It's great if you have an idea what the host plant is, just to get a female. Moths are different than butterflies. The females generally, if you put them in a container, will lay eggs, and then you can offer them plants and find out what they will eat. And so I'll show you an example of that in the meantime. So using taxonomy to uncover caterpillar host plants. First, we're going to go in that direction, then I'll talk about the other. This is a quest I am still working on. I'm sad to say I was able to visit Camille and Kat, their places a couple weeks ago, and I got some, I already forgot the name of them, getting too old. Thank you, Bractozornia, because that was the closest relative I could find to Nassolia. Unfortunately, my caterpillar was only feeding for a couple of days after I offered it, and it did not switch. So I have to start over. But there's no known host for Zilpas in the valley. So that's my personal quest in the future. I'm still trying to figure out what they might use, because they're flying around all over the place. They got to come from somewhere. They got to eat something, right? But my first experience with Dr. Wagner was a moth called Rifargia benitensis. And he says, I want to find this thing. And it had a relative. The one we're looking for is on the left. The one on the right is the relative. Back then, it was in the genus Heterocampa. Then they moved it. So, but the funny thing about this is the common name was based on the genus. The common name is small Heterocampa. So you're going to look up the wrong thing if you use that. But it was known, the small Heterocampa is known to feed on various hackberries. In our area, Palo Blanco, Celtis, Leovigata. So he decided caterpillar, the moth is US range is pretty much the lower valley. And in fact, it was described from San Benito. And he's looking at the map and saying, well, the only hackberries down there are Palo Blanco and what we call Granjeño. So he decided it feeds on that. And for several years, we're beating the bushes, no luck. And then one day, he went to Sable Palm and he found a caterpillar. He was all excited. And I'm thinking it was the same year or the next year, he got a female and we got eggs, and then I raised it. And it was fun. I've also raised the other species to compare them. On the left, this is a first instar, they call it, when it just comes out of the egg. This is what it looked like. All sorts of horns, antlers. If that was as big as a trophy buck, people would be shooting it. And the cousin on the right side has a different coloration of the spines, but also nice antlers. And then as they grow older and they molt, everything gets smaller. The antlers, I mean, the rest of the caterpillar grows until nothing. But I think these are neat. Let's see, with this zoom, maybe you can see it. This one, it's like it has leopard spots on the lower half of the body. And this one, it's just dots. And so aside from the food plants, that's another way to tell them apart. But when they are feeding, you can see the way they, or even if they're resting, the way they sit, it's the edge of the leaf. And it's got little spots, and these don't really show it, these pictures, but some of them would have purplish brown spots on them. So you can see how they would really blend into the leaf and help them hide from birds and anything else that might want to prey on them. So this was my first experience. Took about 4 years for us to get it done. That was actually pretty easy. The next challenge was a moth called, wait a minute, I got to go back. I missed something here. Forgot. Since this one, am I pressing the wrong button? Yeah. All right. Since this one over here is called Rifargia benitensis for San Benito, I think the common name should be San Benito Rifargia. But since the other one is small head orcampa, are we going to name this one San Benito head orcampa? I'm confused. They have to change the genuses, but who knows? All right. Anyways, Tamaulipan Syssphinx. I'm making up that name because as far as I know, there is no common name. But the scientific name, it was named after Tamaulipas, Mexico. And so it makes sense to me to call it that. There were some German researchers working in Mexico. How that works, I don't know, but they were. And they described the Tamaulipan Syssphinx. Originally, it was assumed that the moth was the same species as one that's very common in the northeast of the United States called the honey locust moth. And everybody thought down here, it just was smaller and they didn't know what it fed on, but they didn't care. Up north, as the name implies, it feeds on locust trees. They just assumed it was the same species because they basically look alike, except this one's a little bit smaller. Well, these guys, I'm not sure if they did DNA or some other form of identification. They figured out it was not the same moth, not the same species. And so Dr. Wagner saw what they had figured out that year, and he said, those moths in Brownsville have got to be the new species. We have to collect the larva and we have to get credit for it. So he sent me on a quest. And back in 2014, we were beating trees. So we'd walk around Sable Palm Grove beating trees. That's where we do a lot of our research. We knew there were 3 other species. So the one on the top left is the one we're looking for. Top right, on Bug Guide, it called it high-leg-brooch mesquite moth. I've heard it called honey mesquite moth also, but anyway, it's the mesquite moth. That one's pretty common out west. At the Palm Grove, you'll also see the white-line Syssphinx and Blanchard Syssphinx. And we knew that the mesquite moths ate mesquite, and also Huisache and maybe Huisachio, anyways, Acacia farnesiana and Acacia schaffneri. Blanchard's eats mainly ebony. And in fact, when we started looking for the Tamaulipan, we had not found it on those other 2. So as far as we knew, basically, the mesquite moth was the only one that ate more than one host plant. The white-line Syssphinx, it eats tepeguaje, Leucaena. Is that how you say it? Leucaena? Anyways, those big fern-like leafed trees in Sable Palm. And because of all this information, we knew it almost certainly fed on a group called mimosids, which would include all these, basically the thorny pea family trees, like mesquites and what used to be called acacias. And most of these, and also he was including information of many other species throughout the US. And they're still all pretty much 1 or 2 species of host plant. So he said, it's got to be one of these trees. And we've searched them all and we can't find it. By the way, I wanted to share this one particularly with y'all because these are the prettiest caterpillars I think you can find. The pictures don't do them justice. The spines in sunlight or in good light, all this is mirrored, shiny, silvery. And each of them has some differences, but they're not real clear, except for this one, the white line Syssphinx. It's got a lot of yellow on the inside, and it looks more yellowish than all the others. And one of the problems is they're all highly variable, except for the white line Syssphinx, in the size of these spines. Like this one can have pretty much even over here and same down here, or they can be more reduced. So we said, we've got these 3 species already, but we wondered, have we just mixed some of the others in and not reared them successfully? And that's why we haven't identified it. Could it be on the same host as one of the other trees? So those were some of the issues that we had to deal with. This is the white line Sphinx face. I know some ladies like pearls. This one's covered with them, just gorgeous. And you can see them at night with a flashlight or with a black flashlight. So when we started, we were examining pictures to see if we could pick out anything that might look different. And nothing stood out. And these were the hosts that we identified, and we were particularly wrapping with sticks over sheets. And we had very limited success with these caterpillars because they really hold on tight. Some caterpillars, you tap the branch, it's gone. But these things hold on tight, so they don't often come off. And plus, we're dealing with trees and we can't climb the tree. I'm not sure how I would beat a branch while I was climbing a tree, but so we didn't have much success. In 2018, we switched to black flashlights. They were starting to become popular and cheap. And if you have not done this, at some point, get one that has at least 50 LEDs, and then walk around a rural area at night. You probably could do it here, but someplace like Sable Palm, I don't know what other place you can get in at night, but the parks. It's fascinating how much stuff will fluoresce. Scorpions, obviously. By the way, I've learned something about scorpions. The later at night it is, the higher in the tree they are. Which makes me really glad I did most of the beating before I used a black flashlight. It's like, I could have dropped that on my head. Not good. But these caterpillars and certain others fluoresce, and also there's lots of lichens and algae and stuff. So it's really fun. And not to mention, or maybe I shouldn't mention at Sable Palm, there's a rat that runs around the trees that fluoresces underneath, and there's some snakes that fluoresce that are up in trees. So, I mean, it's just very entertaining to see what's around that you never notice without a black flashlight. But the black flashlight has made our job so much easier. It really, as far as for those caterpillars that will fluoresce, and we knew that the Syssphinx caterpillars did fluoresce. Also, the big Sphinx moth caterpillars. It's a good way to find them. Wrong button. Okay, but anyways, so even with black flashlights, 2 years, and he has permission like to stay at Sable Palm and stuff. So I mean, we'd be all night there running a black light, walking around the park. No success. Until in 2020, he caught a female. And I didn't mention this with the others, but these are not moths that are flying all the year. And so it's challenging to be there at the right time. We have to have good rains, and we haven't had good rains in the fall for several years. So everything has to work together. It did in 2020 for him to get a female. We got eggs, and it was my job to rear them. So I offered what he calls a salad of all the potential hosts, and even I threw in a few more just because, I had room and who knows. And we found the caterpillars feeding on Havartia. This is the caterpillar when it first comes out of the egg. You saw the 4 horns on the front when they're big. This is what they look like when they're small. And it has a little horn on the back, which is back there. And it came out, and I thought, well, this shouldn't be so hard because I can identify that from the others. I've had them all from the egg. That's what I like doing, is actually raising stuff from the egg so you can see it all the way through. And the second instar, it had this nice broad white stripe, which none of the others have. Fourth instar, third instar, it's starting to look more like the others. And it really didn't look very different when it was done. But the problem with Havartia is I have not found anywhere near Falcon State Park, which is where I live near. So I talked to Benito Trevino, and he said, well, there's some trees, or actually it was his wife, I guess, but not far from his place. But from my place, it was a 45-minute drive, and the stuff doesn't keep well. So I had to drive once a week, 45 minutes, get plants, then come back. It'd either be a Friday afternoon or a Saturday, depending on my school schedule, which wore me out because it took more than a month to get it done, I think. But we managed. Unfortunately, the caterpillars did not thrive. That is, I could see I was starting to lose some, and it was concerning. So I put some in a sleeve, which, if you haven't seen it, it's basically netting, and you put the caterpillar on the plant, and then it slides down the plant and you tie it so that the caterpillar's inside the netting, but it's still on a tree in the wild. But actually, when I went back and compared, the ones in the netting had not done any better than the ones at my house. And I've since decided the most common place to find these is Brownsville, Sable Palm, that area. And I think it's much more humid and moist there, especially heavy dews. If I had a plant that would keep, I would mist it, and it would be in an open container. But this stuff just would not last for the caterpillars to eat a week unless I kept them enclosed. And so I just think it was a issue of not having good conditions or good host food for them accessible. But from the eggs, we got a couple through, and there is a very beautiful caterpillar. So happy to see that. Now, this gave us a potential host, but sometimes they'll feed on a plant that you give them that the adults will not lay on in the wild. And that's true of butterflies and moths. So in order for him to write his article, we had to prove that Havartia was a host. And we'd been searching in 2014, now it's 2020, 6 years. In the meantime, we had figured out that Blanchard's Syssphinx also uses Havartia, and that was the only lap we had in any species. So we were kind of like, well, maybe this is not it. But we went back to the park, and this, at least now we also had some clues for identifying it. Blanchard's was, the middle one is the Tamaulipan. Blanchard's is the only one that ate Havartia. If you notice, it's got green horns, whereas these have blue on the tips. That was helpful. The one I was more concerned about confusing it with is the Heiligenbrodes or the mesquite Syssphinx. And the blue is different. And on the tail horn, it's even more noticeable that they have green tips, whereas this one is blue all the way to the tip and the lower part's green. So there were a few things like that. Now, if you're walking around with a black flashlight, you're still going to grab the caterpillar because you can't see those features. But at least we had some ideas how to separate them. And finally, in 2021, we were out in Sable Palm, and we knew where certain trees were. And we always search those. There's one, for example, actually, before you cross the Border Patrol's road to go into the park, there's one on the right side in the little forest there. So that's where we found some blanchards. And we look in the park. And I wandered off. He had somebody with him that he had to entertain. So I wandered off, went by myself walking, and I was like, I'm in a new part of the park. I haven't seen this before. And all of a sudden, a tree lights up, and it was a small tree, and there was this caterpillar on it. So I walked over, and it was Rifargia, and it was the Camelopin Syssphinx. So we had proof. I was excited, and we found a few more. And then when I was talking to him later, in the section where I was, the trees were mostly alone, separated. It was very grassy and just a tree here or there. And his suspicion is that the moths like to fly around and need room. And so if it's in a heavy forest, where a lot of the other trees we looked at were, they're not too accessible to the moths. Now, this is the part, don't record this and put it on the film for Sable Palm to know. When I walked back, I saw the back of the sign. I said, I wonder what this sign says. And then I knew why I had never been in that section of the park before, because it says, do not pass. Oh. Well, actually, I was walking away from Mexico at the time because I started further south. But, you know, I don't know why they had a sign there, but I obey signs for some reason. And so I had never gone to that section of the park. And so I didn't even know there was Rifargia there, or we probably could have gotten permission. But anyways, so we were laughing about that later. I got lost, and that's how I found the caterpillar. There's always a little bit of luck or providence involved in finding them. Whoops, wrong buttons again. Okay, so that was a big adventure, and the article is available online. You can download it now. It was published in the Lepidopterist Society magazine, and he was very happy to be able to get it done. And we had for me, I had a great time. I mean, yeah, it was frustrating we couldn't find it for those years, but it's a great excuse to get out and walk around and see nature. So that's one of the things. Another example, I didn't talk to him about it, so I don't have any pictures and I can't give details, but another moth that he's been looking for a long time, he said, it's got to be on this plant. He said, I think it is. And, you know, with this and with this other moth, I'm starting to think, you know, after all this time, maybe we're not looking in the right places. But it was a beach type of plant, I guess, sand sheet at least. So we've searched years. And then this past year, I happened to be there at a different time and searched and found it. Or at least we think so. He's going to have it barcoded because this particular type of moth, it's very difficult to actually get them to emerge, even if you get them to pupate. But the interesting thing about that was, and maybe another year or two, I'll be able to share the story whenever he gets done writing the articles. We found there's actually two caterpillars I found, and not 100% certain which is which, because he's guessing, we don't know at this point, that one of them is what they call a hidden species or a cryptic species. That is, it looks like some other moth, and because it's in the same family as the first caterpillar, but there's no more moths identified that it could be. So it probably looks like something else as an adult, although it can be identified by the caterpillar. But we'll have to see. Maybe in a year or two, I'll have something to add to this. All right. So those were a couple of cases where we knew the genus, or at least the family group, and we knew where to look, and we finally found the caterpillar he was looking for. Now, the flip side of this is sometimes what we find, if we find a different caterpillars on a plant, they usually one plant will have several different caterpillars that feed on it, it might suggest that it's not as closely related to everything else in that genus as you would think. An example, well, that's what this is saying. I just put the caterpillar picture there because I think they're beautiful caterpillars. And that's a case, by the way, of a cryptic species. They used to say there was one species of two-barred flasher from here all the way to South America. And they found out there like 12 or 13 or 14 different caterpillars on different host plants. And all the moths looked alike. And they eventually figured out that all the moths were different species. You can identify them by the caterpillar, but not by the adult necessarily. But prairie acacia, another plant he had me searching for a long, long time. And I see I forgot a parenthesis. Apologies to all of those that are anxious about that. I've actually got it growing in my yard now because we kept searching it for a certain tiny moth. I don't even remember what it was. Nothing you all would notice, but he observed sometime it should be in its own genus because it was called an acacia back when everything around here was blackbrush acacia and acacia this and acacia that. And he says, whatever feeds on this one doesn't feed on anything else that's called acacia. So they're probably not related. And as far as butterflies, which I'm more interested in, I like caterpillars in general because they're really neat, but moths are kind of plain, so I like the butterflies. Acacia skipper, it's rarely to the valley because the host isn't here very much, but it has shown up. And the Mexican yellow is more common here. They use the plant and then several moths. But given that everything's different that's on it compared to the other acacias, it makes sense that eventually they separated it out. And now we have acaciella for the prairie acacia, and the others are in either Senegalia or Bachelia. But they're still alocaceous to me because I'm too old. But I'm going to suggest one to watch. Now, I am not suggesting they change the genus. So don't get upset with me, Ken. I'm just saying that all these molecule workers may do so. Because granjeño, there's a couple of insects that use it and other hackberries. For example, the hackberry emperor is going to use both in snouts. But there's a whole host of butterflies and moths that use granjeño that don't use other hackberries, at least as far as I know. The prettiest ones, silver emperor and pavon emperor, and this was on my mind because I just got to raise pavon emperors. If you haven't seen the male with the purple upper side, they're just gorgeous. And I had not ever found one in the wild. A friend of mine gave me eggs or some small caterpillars to rear, and I was able to get some adults, and they're gorgeous. They really are. But red border metal mark, Empress Lilia are much more common. Lilia, some people say. And then there's a neat caterpillar. It's at sable palm. I don't know if it's found elsewhere in the valley. I think there's a, sable palm is a real blessing to Dr. Wagner and us that work with him because it extends up from Mexico, and most of the stuff there is Mexican fauna rather than similar species, sister species that are found further north. So without having to go into Mexico, it's a treasure trove for things that you wouldn't find elsewhere. And then once you get out of Brownsville, because things are just so stretched out, it doesn't appear that a lot of the habitat supports these species further north, or the Mexican species. So I think that it's a tiger moth by Turix venisata. I think it's pretty much limited to that area. There are a number of caterpillars that are, or moths. So all of these are feeding on Granjeño and not on Palo Blanco. So however closely related they are, I mean, they're obviously reasonably closely related. They've got similarities, but there's some difference, or else these would be feeding on both. So maybe they'll move it, maybe they won't, but it just thought that would illustrate the fact that the things work both ways with the taxonomy and the plant use. All right. These are, I don't have a picture of the Syssphinx, the Tamaulipan Syssphinx eggs this good, but if you remember, the caterpillar had these 4 dark spines on the head. Well, there they are. You can see a caterpillar fully developed inside the egg. If you have a very good magnifying glass, or in my case, a good macro lens to where you can zoom in on the picture after you take it. And I just think that's neat. All right. My website is there if you'd like to write it down. I have all sorts of butterflies. It's basically dedicated to Starr County butterflies right now. That's where I live. And all the butterflies I've found up there, plus all the caterpillars I've been able to raise from that area are on there, as well as a few moths that interest me. Questions? Yes. As far as I know, only the caterpillars. All right, well, physics is it reflect on no. That's a good question, because my understanding is birds see in ultraviolet, right? So that would make it more visible to birds. I was having this discussion with somebody, but the theory is that it somehow protects the caterpillar from birds, helps it blend in. Either it's, and I don't know, maybe it's sunlight that's reflecting the ultraviolet more, but the theory is that it's helping it be camouflaged and protected from some predator. And especially with big caterpillars, it's probably birds. And yeah, the moth doesn't need that. And also moth, I don't know if you ever looked at a moth's body, but it's usually covered with scales, and the scales do not fluoresce. It's the body of the caterpillar. An interesting one I found recently is that it's called the incense cedar sphinx. It's a rare sphinx. It's in our area. It feeds, I forget the name of the plant. It's a great plant. I love it. It doesn't have any spines. It looks a little bit like the wolfberries. The leaves look a little bit like the wolfberries, but they're finer and they're not as fleshy, but I cannot think of the name. Yes, elbow bush. Thank you. There you go. It feeds on elbow bush. Well, around the face it reflects, and certain parts of the body, but the rest don't. So why it's like that, but the theory is it's camouflage, and somehow that helps it. The birds help it. Let me go back. Okay, yeah, this slide. The only case I know of fluorescing, and it's really not fluorescing, is the silver emperor. If you take a picture straight down, the flash straight down, all this blue area will be brown, just like the rest of this. It's actually diffraction. So in order to see that blue, you have to catch it at just the right angle. And only the males on both of those, only the males have the purple or blue color. The females are just brown with a white stripe, which I think is beautiful also, but in a different way. So a little physics going on, but I don't know of any adults that actually fluoresce. I'm kicking myself now. because I don't know if you can see on the silver emperor, the tongue is fluorescent yellow and same on this one, you can't really see it. It's a fluorescent green, I guess, color, but I didn't try shining a black flashlight on it to see if it would fluoresce at night. And I've already let them go, so. But next time I catch one, I'll try to do that. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Here's one was 45 miles away.
Well, I did not explain it clearly. Dr. Wagner caught a female in Brownsville, and he gave me the eggs, and I took them home. Now, one of the things that had us puzzled is I have had male of the Tamaulipan Syssphinx at my house. I run a black light once in a while to attract moths at night, and I have had them a couple of times. So it seemed to me reasonable that whatever the host plant was, it came out into Starr County. And these are pretty good sized moths, so they could fly a distance. So I would suspect there is Havartia closer to me than Rio Grande City. North of Rio Grande City is where I found it, but I have no idea where it is. But yeah, this is the thing. I live off in the wilderness, and so sometimes it's a real challenge to have fresh host plant because especially stuff from the eastern end of the valley, which is more productive. The eastern end is much wetter and more caterpillars.
I was going to say Tenaza or usually grows close to the water or Rifargia or Arroyo next to water. So if you can find an area where you live that has a stream or water runs through it, that's pretty.
Okay.
Try and find.
Yes.
What's more similarity to molecules, granthennal and guinea grass? Because I've seen snouts feed on both granthennal and guinea grass, but usually once they finish the granthennal, if they do not have any left, they move to guinea grass.
Okay. Now that's interesting. I've never heard of them or seen them feeding on guinea grass.
There was a particularly big year of snouts. There were snouts everywhere, lots of caterpillars. The granthennal was completely eaten, there were no leaves left. And then we noticed them moving to guinea grass.
And they were eating it. Wow. All right.
30 snouts at home off of the guinea grass.
That's a great question. I don't know that. I do know there are a lot of, and I haven't heard of this at all, but there's a lot of caterpillars that when they're in their final instar, they will accept many other foods that they wouldn't accept when they were younger. One example of this, some of you would know what the crimson patch butterfly is. It's going to feed on either Flamacanthus or Carlaridia. But I've found them, and those are family Acanthaceae, right? So I have found them as fifth instars feeding on cowpen daisies, which are aster family composites. So often fifth instars are not as picky as the earlier ones, and that would be my guess. But now I'm going to have to try that because I've never heard of that. That would explain why they can get through. Now, one weird thing I've seen with snouts is I have seen an utterly defoliated tree, and right next to it, one that looks like it hasn't been touched. It's like, what's going on? But, okay. Other questions? Yes. Dave Wagner. Owlet caterpillars of North America, I think. Well, look for Wagner owlet caterpillars. It's not going to be as much of the West Western caterpillars as we would hope, but it's going to be the most of our area that's available. He's had a book out on Eastern caterpillars for a long time, which is useful for the stuff that makes it here. But he's working on the Western caterpillars. I'm not sure it'll ever get published because he's up in the, I'm not sure how many thousand of caterpillars, and I mean, it's just incredible how many, and he's uncovering new species all the time. And I talked to him the other day, he's like, yeah, I'm writing this book on moths of the world. I'm like, what? Where did that come from? He hasn't explained that, but but he's got some grad students, former grad students, that if he doesn't finish it, hopefully we'll carry on, and one day it'll be out. But right now, I would say the book that would be most helpful for something in our area is Owlet Caterpillars by Dave Wagner and a few others. Yes.
I do not remember if I've been to your site before. I'm sure I have. Because I've also been like trying to get into identifying moths because like, I have the butterflies down good, but not moths. But I can see a lot of moths are always like take photos. I try to put them on iNaturalist, but
All right.
not a lot of people are.
My site is not going to have enough moths to really help you. I only have fancy ones. Syssphinx moths, stuff that you're going to identify easily. If you want to identify a moth, the best place is MPG, Moth Photographers Group, or Bug Guide. Between the two of them, MPG doesn't have any keys. Sometimes Bug Guide does. And it's a good example. Use Taxonomy. If you go to MPG, you use Taxonomy. They actually have plates for like geometrids. That's one family. All the inchworm moths, I guess, is what the common would be. And you just go through the plates until you find something that looks right. And then it'll give you a page. And then you can, on MPG, they always have a link to the Bug Guide page, and Bug Guide page always has a link to the MPG. So when I need to identify a moth, that's what I use. The moth book that was written for the Valley is now no longer published, and I don't know if it ever will be republished. So there's not much available for our area. Yes. It's macro moths of the Rio Grande Valley, Bordelin and Knudson, Knudson. But I'd be shocked if you found it. Either that, well, now if you're independently wealthy, I'm sure you could find somebody that would be willing to separate with it. A lot of the genus names will be different now because it's a little bit older and they're revising things, but Bug Guide or sometimes MPG will have the older genus names too, so you can correlate them. Yes. I have not tried here.
We get them every fall on green time. Not the white.
Are you sure they're tomato hornworms?
I like patty, but I have never seen an adult because for whatever reason they do not. They do eat our patty.
When they start to look ugly, I guess, swollen, make sure you give them loose dirt so they can bury themselves, and then keep misting it. I mean, it should be moist when you give it, and then just mist it a little bit. And I think you should be able to get them.
We've done it several times. Sometimes when they're spraying for mosquitoes or whatever, we'll bring all animals inside the caterpillars in the fall. And what I've noticed is that after a few days in captivity, even they have marine vines. They'll start turning a kind of purplish brown color, start getting kind of non-active and it won't revive until like. It's not that it starts like producing anything, but like the caterpillar was like
I've not had that experience.
very.
So, yeah. Now, I would recommend, if at all possible, putting the plant material in water, like poke a hole, saran wrap, and then have it in a vented container. Because humidity sometimes could be an issue. It's much better not to keep them in a totally enclosed container. But other than that, I don't know what's. I would invite you to send me pictures when that happens again. Yeah. Yeah, if they're tomato hornworms. Now, there are several other hornworms that will use the marine vine. That's why I was asking if you're sure they were the tomato, but vine sphinx and a couple more, but I can't think of them right now. All right. Anything else?
One of the things I'd like, the caterpillars that you're finding, the garden, are a very important food item for Ophidian estes, rough green snake. So when you find a lot of these gardens, you also find a few green snake is one of them.
And that's in the trees? That's probably the one I'm seeing when I am out walking at night.
You can spot them with a flashlight at night. You can see them in the day too, obviously.
Yeah.
But they're hard to see them.
Yeah.
In the daytime, I go on, pick my wife, pick my brother, and I watch.
Okay. I'll stick with caterpillars. I don't think I need to whack snakes out of trees. Especially when my wife's along. All right. You're welcome.